18 years after her mom's brutal murder, Keysha Brown finally has closure. Her entire family embracing after police shared an update Thursday connecting 48-year-old Norman Flowers to Keysha Brown's October 2004 murder.
On the quiet evening of October 19, 2004, a 28-year-old mother named Keysha Brown was found lifeless in her home in Las Vegas, her body battered and violated. The police were left with a thin trail of evidence and no suspects in sight. The case eventually went cold, but the detectives never forgot Keysha. Several years later, the hunt for her killer reignited, and DNA technology helped shed new light on the investigation. So who was this ruthless murderer? And what was their motive behind this killing? Las Vegas is a city that never sleeps. It is the most populous city in the state of Nevada. With its iconic casinos, world-class entertainment, and endless nightlife, it's no wonder that this desert oasis has become a playground for adults seeking thrills and excitement. But beyond the glitz and glamour lies a fascinating history. From the early days of mobsters and showgirls to the modern-day transformation into a global entertainment capital. It is within this fascinating city that a brutal murder case unfolds. Keysha was born in the mid-1970s, but much of her life is shrouded in mystery. There is not much known about her early years, as there is scarce information about her parents' names, the schools she attended, or whether she had any siblings. But what is certain is that she was a young mother living in a modest apartment on the bustling East Flamingo Road in the year 2004. Her daughter Keysha was her pride and joy, and she would do anything to ensure her little girl had a better life. What exactly Keysha did to make ends meet is also unknown, but what is evident is that she was a survivor, a woman who refused to let life beat her down. At the time, Keysha was also in a relationship with a man who was only identified as her boyfriend and whose connection to Keysha remains unknown. The events of October 19, 2004, which was a Tuesday, would forever be etched in the memories of those who knew Keysha. That day, witnesses saw a stranger arrive in a red sedan and park outside her apartment. No one knew who he was or what his intentions were, but he wasted no time in entering Keysha's apartment. It is not clear where Keysha's daughter was at the time, but she was not around and was safely away from the apartment. For several minutes, the man was inside, and then he finally emerged with a duffel bag in his hand. He darted back to his car, started the engine, and sped away into the night, leaving a trail of speculation in his wake. Those who saw him would later describe him as a black male with a stocky build. Some 7 minutes before 7 p.m., Keysha's boyfriend made his way to her apartment, eager to see his beloved. But when he knocked on the door, there was no response. Frowning, he tried the doorknob, and to his surprise, it turned easily in his hand. With a sense of foreboding, he pushed open the door and entered the apartment. Silence greeted him, and his voice echoed through the empty apartment as he called out for Keysha. But there was no response, and this was when his anxiety began to mount. With each passing moment, he searched the apartment, moving from room to room. It was in the bathroom that he found her, lying motionless in the bathtub, concealed beneath a pile of clothes. With a jolt of shock, he realized that something was very wrong. She wasn't moving, and as he leaned in closer, he could see that she wasn't breathing. He could also see blood and realized that she had been stabbed. He checked for a pulse, but there was none to be found. Keysha's boyfriend's heart raced as he realized the gravity of the situation. He knew he had to act fast if there was any hope of saving her, and so he raised an alarm. Within moments, concerned neighbors started streaming into the apartment, alerted by the commotion. The minutes that followed were a blur of chaos and confusion as multiple people frantically called the emergency line to report what had happened. Time seemed to stand still as they waited for help to arrive. At 7:13 p.m., the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department was informed of the incident and rushed to the apartment. They were joined by paramedics who arrived at the scene, but it was too late. Keysha was beyond saving. Her body was carefully removed from the apartment and taken for an autopsy. The moment detectives arrived at the crime scene, they knew they had their work cut out for them. They meticulously collected DNA evidence from the scene, which they stored away, knowing it could be the key to unlocking the mystery. They also began questioning anyone who might have seen or heard something, including Keysha's boyfriend. It was during one of these interrogations that they heard about the strange man in the red sedan who had been seen visiting Keysha's apartment from eyewitnesses who had seen him. The detectives couldn't shake the feeling that this man was involved in Keysha's death, but all they had was a vague description of the man's appearance. No one had been able to get a good look at him, and there was no surveillance footage in the area to help them identify him. But the detectives refused to give up. They combed the neighborhood, knocked on doors, and talked to anyone who might have information. They knew that every lead, no matter how small, could be the key to solving the case. The results of Keysha's autopsy were soon revealed, and the findings were nothing short of disturbing. The Clark County Coroner's Office, which conducted the autopsy, concluded that she was strangled to death in a brutal homicide. But that wasn't all. The autopsy also showed that Keysha had been assaulted, stabbed, and beaten. The news sent shockwaves through the community as people tried to come to terms with the brutality of the crime. The hunt for the perpetrator continued, with law enforcement leaving no stone unturned in their pursuit of justice for Keysha. As they worked tirelessly day and night to solve the case, the detectives couldn't help but wonder who the mysterious man was and what he knew about Keysha's untimely demise. Despite their relentless efforts, the case remained unsolved, leaving Keysha's family to mourn their loss and grapple with the question of who had taken her life so viciously. As time went on, the case went cold. After years of gathering dust, Keysha's unsolved case finally got a second chance when it was assigned to the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department Homicide Coldcase Unit. In August of 2022, the department decided to do a review of the case, bringing together some of the most experienced detectives to work on it. As the team began to sift through the details of the case, Detective Dan Long discovered a new lead that had previously been overlooked. He recognized a pattern that he had come across in some cases he had investigated back in 2005. Detective Dan had previously worked on a case that involved the murder of 3 unrelated young women on different occasions. The 3 women were murdered in a similar manner, and their bodies had been left in the same way. A man by the name of Norman Flowers had been the culprit in all 3 cases, and he was currently serving 3 life sentences in prison. Norman's criminal history was a chilling and gruesome tale of terror. During the first few months of 2005, he embarked on a spree of burglaries that turned into violent attacks. His first known victim was 18-year-old Sheila Quarles, the daughter of his ex-girlfriend Deborah Quarles. Norman had spent a total of 10 years in prison and had been paroled twice. It only took him about 20 days after his last release to murder Sheila. On March 24, 2005, he barged into Sheila's apartment and viciously assaulted her in the bathroom. He brutally beat and then strangled her to death. To add insult to injury, he left her body face up in the tub, which was filled with scorching hot water. Before fleeing the scene, he took her cell phone, bank card, and jewelry. In the weeks that followed, Norman played the role of the supportive ex-boyfriend, even going so far as to recommend counseling to the bereaved Deborah. Little did she know, the monster responsible for her daughter's murder was right under her nose. On May 4, 2005, more than a month after the incident, Norman struck again. This time around, he targeted not 1 but 2 women in the space of just 8 hours. First, he broke into the apartment of Marilee Coote, a 45-year-old woman who had the misfortune of crossing paths with a depraved criminal. Norman bludgeoned, assaulted, and ultimately strangled her to death. But he was not done yet. As the night wore on, he descended on another apartment belonging to the 25-year-old Rena Gonzalez. Like Marilee before her, Rena was no match for the viciousness of Norman's attack. She was assaulted and strangled with a telephone cord. Norman was interviewed by the police a few days later, but he denied any involvement in the gruesome murders. His lies, however, were no match for the power of forensic evidence. With the help of DNA that was found on Marilee's body, detectives were able to catch him. On June 6, 2005, his reign of terror came to an end and he was arrested and charged with the murder of Marilee. The evidence against Norman was overwhelming, and the authorities were also able to link him to the murders of Sheila and Rena. In 2008, Norman went to trial for the murder of Sheila. Prosecutors pushed for the death penalty against him, but Norman's family members pleaded with the jurors to spare his life. They testified that Norman had suffered physical and sexual abuse as a child, which had left him traumatized and unstable. Despite his family's testimony, the jurors found Norman guilty and sentenced him to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. In August 2011, he received 2 more life sentences for the murders of Marilee and Rena. Detective Dan's heart raced as he pored over the details of Norman's grisly crimes. He felt deep down that Keysha's unsolved murder was somehow connected to this man. He knew that he needed concrete evidence to make an arrest, and DNA testing was the only way to confirm his suspicions. With a sense of urgency, Detective Dan quickly packaged up the evidence from Keysha's case and sent it off to the DNA lab. He couldn't wait to get the results back. The thought of finally bringing closure to Keysha's family after all these years drove him forward. It's not been disclosed which pieces of evidence were sent for testing. The days turned into weeks, and Detective Dan and the rest of his team grew increasingly restless. They knew finding Keysha's killer was crucial, not just for justice but for their own peace of mind. Finally, on December 21, 2002, the call they had been waiting for came in. The results were in, and they were conclusive. The evidence from Keysha's case was a match for Norman's DNA. After years of searching, they had finally caught their man, and they could hardly believe that he had been right under their noses all the while. With the available evidence, it also became clear that Keysha had been Norman's first victim. After this, the detectives began to formulate a plan to bring Norman to justice for the murder. They didn't have to look for him since he was locked up at the High Desert State Prison in Nevada, where he was serving his 3 life sentences. On February 23, 2023, the detectives secured an arrest warrant for Norman. The charges were severe, and this included open murder with a deadly weapon, sexual assault with a deadly weapon, and burglary with a deadly weapon. The detectives were determined to make sure that Norman paid for his crimes against Keysha, no matter where he was. As the news of Norman's arrest spread, a police briefing was held on the same day. Keysha's family was invited to attend, and her daughter Kalia arrived with a heavy heart, visibly shaken and emotional. With tears streaming down her face, she expressed gratitude towards the police force for providing her with a sense of closure. Keysha's murder is a tragic reminder of the dangers that can lurk in our communities. Despite the devastating loss, Detective Dan and his team's unwavering dedication to finding justice brought some measure of comfort to Keysha's loved ones. But the case also raises questions about the failings of our justice system and the need for better prevention and rehabilitation programs to prevent such tragedies from happening in the first place. So, how do you think we create a safer society for all? Let us know your thoughts in the comment section. On a cold winter morning on January 2, 1983, 28-year-old Nancy McEvers, née Pepper, died in her home in the Durham neighborhood of Washington County in Oregon. No foul play was suspected, and it was believed she took her own life. The case went cold as it was believed to be a suicide, and the family tried making their peace with Nancy's death. After 40 years, new evidence came into light that changed the entire course of the case. The mystery of Nancy McEvers' case finally reached its conclusion in 2023. What had happened to Nancy that day? What new evidence led police to find the answers after 4 decades? Welcome back to Mysterious Hook, where we shed light on under-the-radar cases across the country. Today, we are looking at the 40-year-old cold case of Nancy McEvers that has finally received closure in 2023. Washington County makes up the Portland metropolitan area and is the second most populous county in Oregon, which has 36 total counties. Away from the bustling cities, the breathtaking scenery and the lush greenery that surrounds the area is one of the main reasons why people find comfort in the Washington County of Oregon and like to settle here. The hills and mountains that envelop the majestic landscape, friendly people, and the old-fashioned homes are the charm of this region. Home to about 600,000 people, it is the most populous Washington County in America. With a culturally vibrant community and a myriad of options for recreational activities like hiking, nature walking, and fishing, it offers a haven for people seeking to get away from the rush of daily life. But sadly, it also holds dark secrets, and it is here that our case takes place today. Nancy McEvers, née Pepper, was born in Oregon in 1955. Nancy's mother, Lenore Pepper, now 97, was used to hearing the words sweet and beautiful when people spoke about her daughter. Everyone, whether they knew her for years or had just met her, referred to her as a friendly person. Nancy was close to both of her sisters. Being the middle child, she was loved by both her elder sister, Janet Aglitis, and her younger sister, Diane Grill. She often acted as a mediator between her mother and the sisters. Her loving and caring nature, coupled with her outgoing personality, was why people loved interacting and spending time with her. She had always been the caring one among her sisters, and her maternal instincts were really strong. So when she got married to Randy McEvers and had a son, she really enjoyed being a mom. It was one thing that everyone knew about her: she loved being a mom. Nancy's love towards her own child and for her sisters carried the sisters' childhood dreams forward. All the 3 sisters had planned on raising their kids together. Coincidentally, the 3 sisters had their first children within 18 months of each other. The plan of giving them a happy and close-knit upbringing was already in the works. But in a tragic twist, it was to be left incomplete in the end. January 2, 1983 was a cold winter's morning in beautiful Washington County in Oregon. Around 10:38 a.m., police received a call from Randall McEvers. Randall seemed to be distraught that his wife had taken her own life. Washington County Sheriff's Office deputies reached the 17300 block of Southwest Rivendell Drive located in the Durham neighborhood, which was not a part of Washington County then, but was incorporated into it after 1983. The police officers, assisted by the Oregon State Police Medical Examiner's Office, Oregon State Police Crime Lab, and Washington County Medical Examiner's Office, found the body of Nancy McEvers, née Pepper, with a gunshot wound to the head. Despite the nature of the wound and very low chances of Nancy making it out alive, paramedics rushed to get Nancy to a nearby hospital. She was almost immediately pronounced dead. On the surface, the death of Nancy McEvers checked out as a suicide case. Investigators found and seized a Smith & Wesson revolver from the crime scene. It was only when the police started interrogating people that inconsistencies started showing up. When the alleged suicide had happened, it was just Nancy who had been home with her 30-year-old husband and 1-year-old son. The crime scene made the detectives ask the question whether the suicide happened in a closed space or if Randall was a witness to it. The interrogation that followed raised the red alarms. The police had to wait for forensic reports to take the investigation forward. When they got the reports back, the case of Nancy McEvers, née Pepper, turned out to be a lot more complex than the police had anticipated. Following the autopsy report, forensic tests, and ballistic tests, it did not take long for investigators to understand that there was something else at play here. The medical reports by the Oregon State Police Crime Lab soon revealed that the case could not have been a suicide. There were way too many things that were off. A person who has recently fired a gun would have residue on their hands and clothes, which is tested by lifting samples and processing them to check for fused particles of lead, antimony, or barium. The first inconsistency was that Nancy had no gunshot residue on her hands, but it did not prove anything directly. This is because the residue can only be detected within 6 to 8 hours of the shot being fired, and it can easily be washed away from being in contact with other things. So while it was an important discovery, it was not enough. The second inconsistency arose when the medical examiners reported that Nancy's wound was too broad for it to be a suicide case. The wider the wound, the greater the distance of the gun's muzzle from the person. Further, it was also mentioned in the report that the charred particles on her clothes meant that Nancy was struggling or trying to defend herself. Nancy had been home alone with her husband Randall and her 1-year-old child. Randall had not mentioned the presence of any other person or instances of forced entry. So naturally, the police had found their prime suspect. Detectives initiated their interrogation with Randall. After giving them basic details, he went on to confess that Nancy and him were struggling over the gun, and during that chaos, he didn't remember who had pulled the trigger. When the police prodded more and asked the questions again, Randall retracted his statement, changed the story, and presented a new version to the officers. He told police that he had just entered the room when Nancy was pulling the trigger. There was no struggle possible as she had already shot herself by the time Randall walked into the room and realized what was happening. Both these versions were exactly opposite to one another. It was important to find out what had really happened. So the detectives approached the people who were close to Nancy, including her relatives, friends, and co-workers. Every one of them suspected Randall to have some kind of involvement in her death. The police had just wanted a little more evidence to finally make a sense of the situation and build a strong case against Nancy's husband. So the police called in Randall for questioning again 2 days after the initial interrogation. They could not get a confession out of him. Randall's parents then showed up at the police station and assured them that their son was ready to go through a polygraph test to highlight his innocence. But Randall was a no-show for the scheduled test. By April, he had entirely stopped cooperating with the police. Without any other leads and new evidence, the police marked the case of Nancy McEvers' alleged suicide as cold. A week after Nancy's funeral, her family members were informed that no foul play suspicions had led anywhere and there were no further leads in the case. So the family tried their best to put this dark chapter behind them. After her death in 1983, not only was her son deprived of all the love that Nancy had to give, but also her entire family changed forever. They were deeply affected by the news. Nancy was such a huge part of their lives that they were never the same after she was gone from their lives. When Nancy's family found out about her death, they could not believe it. She was a cheerful and easygoing person who loved every bit of raising her child. To think that Nancy shot herself dead with her son still in the house was unbelievable to her family. She would never have done anything like this, which would separate herself from her son in such a final manner. Lenore Pepper, Nancy's mother, had her doubts about Nancy's death. She suspected Randall, but could not say anything about it. She had already lost her daughter, and after the police officially told them that there was no foul play suspected, Lenore Pepper let her suspicions die. With no charges against him, Randall was responsible for raising his 1-year-old son. Lenore did not want to stir up something she did not know how to handle. She had strong doubts about Randall, but stayed silent to protect her grandson, just in case her confusions and questions turned out to be false. Not just Nancy's mother, but everyone who knew Nancy thought that it could not have been a suicide. But without any confirmation from the investigators, their doubts remained doubts. Nancy's sister believed that it was a terrible accident that was never meant to happen. She was just 28 when she died. Her dreams, her aspirations, and her entire life disappeared in a second. The case of Nancy McEvers had been closed for so long that no one expected it to be reopened by the detectives in August 2022. The officers assigned to the Violent Crimes Unit were in charge of the cold case investigations. When they went through the file of Nancy McEvers, they knew that justice had to be served. The world did not even know that Nancy hadn't committed suicide. She was murdered in cold blood. Before moving forward, the police went over the previously collected evidence. Detective Anel Sarek, part of the investigation team, called the case poorly investigated. The police work of the officers in the 80s was not thorough. And since the detective in charge from 1983 had already passed away, there was no way of knowing why the officers let this case go cold for so many years. The evidence taken in 1983 was retested by the Washington County Sheriff's Office Forensic Science Unit, and the forensic report came out to be exactly as similar to the previous one. The possibility of Nancy's death being a suicide was completely ruled out. The police now believed that this case had an angle of domestic violence that resulted in the death of Nancy McEvers. Investigators did not release a description in the media detailing which new leads were explored due to concern for the family's privacy. The police carried out interviews with around 20 people, some of whom were deputies, detectives, firefighters, and family members who were either present at the scene in 1983 or were closely involved in the case. Even after 40 years, Nancy's story was alive. It became evident as additional evidence came to light after all these years. Nancy's file mentioned that when the police were interviewing people who knew Nancy and Randall, they revealed that he had been planning to kill Nancy because she wanted to get a divorce and leave him. Anel Sarek, one of the investigators on the case, showed his confusion about no action being taken in the 80s despite direct evidence. He said, "Why they did the things they did, I can't tell you." But finally, everything was falling in place, and Randall was slowly but surely turning out to be the prime suspect in the murder of Nancy McEvers. At this time, Randy was living in Tigard, a city in Oregon, 10 miles south of Portland. The police approached him at his house in January 2023 and questioned him about the incident. He told the detectives that he had gone through hypnotherapy to make him forget everything related to that day. The police by now had enough leads, and they wanted Nancy's family to receive real closure. So after their interview with Randall, they referred the case to the district attorney's office in Washington County for their review. The information that Nancy's family had been living with for 40 years turned out to be false. While there had been enough twists in the case of Nancy McEvers till this point, police were shocked to find out that Randall had taken his own life on February 8, 2023. He also wrote a note in which he denied any responsibility for Nancy's death. Although the DA's office could not review the case after Randall's death, the police believed that this was a closure in itself. After the death of their prime suspect, Nancy McEvers' case is now finally closed. It came as a shock when the police reached out to Lenore in August 2022. She could not believe that her suspicions about her daughter's death had been true all along. Nancy's mother, Lenore, showed her gratitude to the police officers for being able to see it through to the end. She wished Nancy's father had been alive to finally witness their daughter's story getting closure. Getting to know about Randall's suicide, Lenore Pepper said, "I feel like we got justice, but like I said, in a very strange way. But at my age, I don't know if I could have gone to a trial every day, so we have to accept that. That's all we can do." Nancy was loved by all, so the news of her vicious murder stirred multiple emotions. Her sisters stated that they felt every emotion all over again. But the entire family believed that Randall's suicide was as much evidence as his actual trial in court. He denied having any involvement in Nancy's death, but his own death turned out to be an acceptance that Nancy's family had been waiting for 4 decades. "We're exempt from going through a trial and being drugged," said Nancy's younger sister, Diane Grill. "It was hard. It's been tough for 40 years. As my sister said, we've got the answers now because we need to finish it." Nancy's family is sharing the news with more of her loved ones, and they are planning to conduct a memorial service for her. After the shock of learning that their beloved Nancy had been murdered after 40 years, they have developed new grief and trauma. Nonetheless, the entire family was grateful to the investigation team who served justice to her. For 40 years, Nancy's family believed that she had ended her own life. Little did they know that their initial doubts about her death were all valid and led directly to the answer that Nancy's husband had killed her. Although the case has been closed now, Washington County Sheriff's Office deputies are still open for more information on Nancy McEvers' death. They want anyone with new and relevant information to step forward and call detectives at 503-846-2700 to serve justice to Nancy, who was believed to be dead by choice for all these years. Do you believe that Randall killed his wife? Why didn't the detectives in the 80s make a solid case against Randall? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section. Do not forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Until next time, stay safe, and thanks for watching.